Everyone, this is Stacy from Stacy Cakes doing my very first tutorial, how to cover a cake with fondant. If there is a technique you'd like to see, be sure to comment below and I'd be happy to make a video for you. So you're going to start by putting cornstarch on your work surface and then wiping away the excess. You don't want a big clump of cornstarch, you just want your surface to be covered. What I'm doing now is I'm breaking up my fondant into smaller pieces so that just to make it easier to work. I find taking one massive clump of fondant and trying to work it it's really difficult. So take smaller pieces and break them up and mold them, and then you can add more to it as your fondant gets warmer with your body heat. So what I'm doing is I'm using the balls of my hand and I'm just shoving it down to work it and make it warm. So there's a good test to know when your fondant's ready. You can pull it apart, and if you see tear marks when you pull it apart, it's not ready. You want to keep working it until you get to a warmer temperature. And I'm speeding it up here because you don't need to see all of the folding. But here we go. So when we tear it apart, you can see the stretch. You can see how malleable it is. That's what you're looking for when you're working your fondant. You really want that stretch to your fondant because that's going to help you when you're covering your cake. All right, so now what I'm doing is I'm rolling it into a ball. Now that it's the right temperature and the right consistency, I guess. And then you're going to take your cornstarch and you're going to spread it underneath, put it on your hand, plop it on top. You don't want a lot of cornstarch, but you really don't want it to stick. That's going to wreck things. So when you're rolling your fondant, you're going to want to glide your hands down to your forearms and always go up and down. When it's time to change the direction, pick up the fondant. And as you can see, I've got some fondant sticking to my roller, and so I just grab a little cornstarch. I don't know if you can see it there, but you grab a little cornstarch from the side where I put a big pile of it, and just throw it over the top, and that'll stop it from sticking. So you want to roll it to about an 1/8 of an inch. You don't want it too thick, because if it's too thick, it's going to the weight of it's going to pull, and that's going to tear. And if you do it too thin, then it doesn't give you enough to work with to stretch the fondant and give you a smooth finish. I always like to roll my fondant onto the pin to make sure that it goes on quickly and smoothly. And now I'm just unrolling my fondant and plopping it on the cake. Now, if your fondant's the right temperature, you can actually do what I do here and lift it up again and plop it back on. That is dangerous. If your fondant's even slightly the wrong consistency, that will tear your cake, and it might, depending on the temperature of your cake, it might pick up some of the icing and pull it off with it, which means you have to re-ice the cake. So I usually recommend just leaving the fondant where it lies. So you always want to start smoothing the edges at the top corners, because that's where the majority of tears are going to happen there. So smooth it down there just to attach it to the cake and stop it from tearing. So what I'm doing here is I am slowly working my way down the cake. I'm just smoothing it a little bit further down, and I'm pulling at the bottom. I don't know if you can see it very well, but I'm grabbing the fondant at the bottom of the cake, and it's just the process of pulling and smoothing, because that's why you want your fondant 1/8 of an inch, so that it gives it that thickness and the opportunity to stretch. And the lower you get, the more difficult it's going to become. But as long as you've rolled it to the right thickness, you should be able to have a smooth finish. This is when you're really going to see if you've rolled it too thin. And a lot of this is just doing it and learning by feel. I can say 1/8 of an inch, but until you're actually using it and seeing how it works with your cake, you're not going to find your perfect thickness. Yep, and just some more pulling and smoothing and pulling and smoothing. And more pulling and smoothing. Another thing, I didn't end up having any with this cake, but a lot of the times when you're doing this, you're going to end up with some air bubbles. If that happens, don't try and take the fondant off of the cake again. Grab a sewing needle or something really, really thin, poke the hole where the air bubble is, and then smooth it out from the sides right to where the hole is. And that will help you get rid of any air bubbles. I wouldn't recommend taking the fondant off again, because once it's attached to that icing, you don't want to mess with it. So here I'm using my fondant smoother to try and get some really smooth edges and a really pretty finish. I just dip it in some cornstarch. You can see I used a little bit too much there. I usually don't like to have excess cornstarch, but that's easy enough to wipe away with a paintbrush. Now, if you really, really want those tight corners, what you can do instead of what I'm doing here is you can actually flip the cake over onto another board, and just make sure that I would usually put a piece of parchment paper between the board and the fondant because you don't want it to stick. But you can get some really sharp edges if you flip the cake over, and instead of cutting it with an X-Acto knife like I am here, you can fold the fondant over. And there's lots of different options, but I chose to cut it away because I'll be putting ribbon on the bottom of this one. If you don't like using an X-Acto knife, a pizza cutter will work just fine. Even a sharp knife from the kitchen. You don't need fancy tools to do this. If you're new to this and looking for some tools, I would recommend the plastic roller. That's definitely a lifesaver for me. Same with the fondant smoother. And one of the biggest things you'll want is a turntable. I can't imagine trying to make a cake without a turntable. There's just too much to do to have to try and turn it on your own. You want to just be able to spin it around. So here I'm kind of pinching the edges just to get a tighter corner, and then I'll smooth that out with the fondant roller afterward. And that's about it. That is a covered cake with fondant. That's all you need to cover a cake with fondant. And now you can start decorating. Put some flowers on it, put some ribbon on the bottom. Very pretty. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. If you do want any more tutorials, please do comment below. I will give them with as much detail as I can. And if you have any questions, let me know. I'm happy to answer them. Thank you so much.